Yeah, so I'm going to tell a story about why I came to that class. But what Lorraine said about Lynn, that I believe that's absolutely true. One of her biggest legacies is the way that she brought us together, and her promotion of every person that she touched in her life. She just, as you said, just couldn't wait to tell somebody else about you and your work. And so the story begins. Lynn was a great friend of the research community in Albany. At least for us, we felt that she was our great friend. She gave several talks in and around Albany. The first time that I saw her was at Russell Sage College. And they were celebrating, it's one of the few women's colleges left, and they wanted to celebrate women of great achievement. And I think she was the first speaker of this seminar series that they have there annually now. So this was probably it must have been like 1979, 1980, somewhere around there. And my mentor at the time, Sam G. Russell, a very jolly British gentleman with a big gold tooth. And he came to me one day. I was sitting under the microscope diddling around with something, and he says, "Mate, we have to go to this talk. Lynn Margulis is being honored at Russell Sage College." And he's saying this with a huge smile, and his gold tooth is flashing at me. You know, I said, okay, I'll go. And it was one of her finest talks on, I'm sure it was one of her finest talks on symbiogenesis. And she got a round of applause. But what really drove me to go to that was that it was being held in a church. Russell Sage College has a church that they converted into a classroom and a lecture hall. And it has Tiffany windows, and I think even the exit sign was at Tiffany. And at the end of her talk, McGee Russell just turned to me and says, "Mate, you're going to get paid to do science at some point in your life, hopefully all your life." But he said, "Don't ever forget to dream every now and then." And I didn't really understand what he was saying to me at the time, but he literally had tears in his eyes after hearing Lynn speak. Okay, so fast forward 10 years later, and I'm doing research. I was working on primary cilia and kidney epithelial cells, and I got invited to come here and give a talk in the cell biology program, and I forget exactly who invited me. But there in the front row was Lynn. Well, this was very early on my career, and it was one of those oh crap moments. I'm going to be talking about cilia to the woman who says these should be called undulopodia. And these are non-modal cilia, so they don't undulate or anything. So I'm talking about growing my bugs, and she's shaking her head. They're not bugs. And I'm talking, I'm using all these flippant terms, and every time I looked up, she's just... So after the talk, she waited until everyone left the room, and she begged me, because she knew I worked with foraminifera as well. She begged me to come talk to her class. I thought I was going to get undulopodia'd from the way I abused the language, and still abuse the language. So anyway, fast forward another 5 or 10 years, and the Albany chapter of Sigma Psi, at the time I think I was the treasurer, and we were having a celebration. I can't even remember the event, but it was a humanist celebration. So we had scientists and we had other types of folks. Once again, at a church. It was the Unitarian Universalist Church, I think it was. And Lynn was, and my job was to invite Lynn. People knew that I knew her. And, but she cost a lot of money to speak. I mean, the initial contact we had was more than what we had budgeted for. So I asked Lynn if, is there anything I can do? I mean, we've got this much money. Do you think possibly you could do this? And I didn't know that I was selling my soul, because she says, well, why don't you, I'll tell you what, we'll reduce the rate, and why don't you give a talk at my microbial evolutionary ecology class? And I said, absolutely. I'll do it for the rest of my life. And and I didn't. she took me to my word on that. I think every summer, at least once or twice, she would ask me to pop in. And it was the most delightful thing that I could imagine ever having to do. So fast forward another 10 years, and this fall I was working in the Antarctic, and we had a very small camp in the middle of nowhere. And don't ask me how or why, but we do have internet connections in McMurdo Sound. There's a giant wireless cloud there now. And I got an email in the morning from Laura Parfrey. She said, "Dear Sam, I'm sure perhaps you've heard, but Lynn passed away. And I just wanted to offer my condolences." And I have to say that you know, the work that we do involves dropping down below the ice and diving around places no one has ever seen before. The first person down the dive hole will be probably the only human being in the expanse of the Southern Ocean at all. And people ask me what that's like. And I say, well, you know, it's kind of creepy. It's just you and the universe in front of you. That kind of stuff. But that morning, all I could do was leave the tent and walk out on the ice and look into that vastness at McMurdo Sound. And for the first time, I really felt alone.
Okay, so thank you for the opportunity to speak today about Lynn. Lynn was my mentor. She was my mother figure. She was my dear friend, my colleague, and a kindred mischief maker. So broadly, I studied the evolution of Earth history and in times that are distinctly different from the present, such as high times of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and times like mass extinctions that drive the evolutionary trajectory of life on this planet. What you see here on my title slide is the Earth in the Triassic with the supercontinent of Pangaea, and I added Venus and Mars on either side of Earth to this slide to show the spectrum of climates in the inner solar system. Venus is on the left with the crazy runaway greenhouse. Mars is on the right with a very thin CO2 atmosphere. And I added these because one thing I learned being a Lynn student is that she never wanted a student to constrain his or her thinking. So this slide is a reminder to think broadly, to think multidimensionally, not just interdisciplinary, but interplanetary. And as Andrew mentioned, once you joined the Margulis Lab, it was a lifelong commitment. Lynn became your eternal academic spirit, and no matter where your travels took you, no matter where you went, she somehow resurfaced. This is a picture that I took when I was doing some biodiversity studies in a rainforest in Costa Rica, and these are the 4 great thinkers of biodiversity. We heard about von Humboldt yesterday. The naturalist who set the stage for biogeography, obviously Charles Darwin, who Lynn liked to refer to as Chuck. They were on a first-name basis. Lynn herself, who, as you well know, in 1966 wrote the key paper that many biologists at that time regarded as evolutionary hearsay, which suggested that cooperation was just as important as competition, Darwin's favored motor in evolutionary change among species and within species. And then Chief Seattle, who was the 4th one picked at this National Institute of Biodiversity in Costa Rica. Now, I met Lynn in 1997, my 3rd week as a freshman at Mount Holyoke College. Lynn came to lecture in Narc McMiniman's paleontology class about her work on microbes preserved in termite hindguts, which she liked to think of and told us were relics of the earlier Proterozoic world when the seas and atmospheres were still anoxic. Now, I'd actually heard of Lynn before. I had never had a chance to meet her, and I had only seen her work in small sidebars in biology textbooks, which were actually illicit reading in the school that I went to in the great state of Arkansas at the Arkansas School for Mathematics and Sciences. And even though we concentrated in the physical sciences, concentrations were only available in those days in physics, math, and chemistry, but not biology. And so as a teenager, we decided we needed to rebel and push the boundaries, as all teenagers do. And among other illicit, or not so illicit things, to push these boundaries, we read the works of intellectual giants such as Lynn, Marx, Darwin, and Nietzsche. Now, in that talk, and with any Lynn talk, even though it was on the termite handguts, there was a wide range of tangential material, neurotrichins, so to speak. This is the first video I ever saw that Lynn showed, and this is of a one single cell with many, many nuclei. It looks like it's a tree, but it actually is a marine algae that today is restricted to the Mediterranean. It's in the group called Caulerpa, and these were some of the early reef-building organisms. They get up to about 9 feet. They can have 200 or so of these branches going out in every which way. And they were some of the first reef-building communities in the Precambrian, which set the stage potentially for multicellular life. And when Lynn went through this video, it just blew my mind. I just couldn't believe that this wasn't a plant and that that was one cell. And Lynn was such a fantastic speaker that day. So interested to hear which each of us was involved in, so readily to tell us that Emily Dickinson had gone to Mount Holyoke herself, but had only stayed for 1 year because of a fight with the president of the time, Mary Lyons. And this is that same Caulerpa, and just you can see it growing and the morphogenesis here. Now, that same day, Lynn took quite an interest in me because she said she had actually never met someone from the state of Arkansas, and that she rather fancied my accent and felt perhaps I understood something about diversity after I had shared that I have 3 biological siblings and 24 foster siblings. And that night we went out to get some tea. Lynn realized that I probably was underage, although that didn't bother her so much a little bit later on. And she wasn't very keen on coffee, so we went to the Thirsty Mine, had some tea. We talked about Emily Dickinson, but what Lynn told me that day that was so fascinating, we had just learned about Snowball Earth in Mark's class, was that Moby Dick had actually talked about, in Moby Dick, Herman Melville had actually envisioned a time when Earth was locked in a single ice age, which actually is Snowball Earth, and how he had a deep appreciation for deep time, which obviously is very important to set the stage for evolutionary events. Now, sometime in the wee morning hours, Lynn asked for my phone number. The Thirsty Mine had long closed, so we continued our discussion in her vehicle outside of my dorm room. She took down my number and noted in her notebook that I was one of a diverse many with a southern accent, but not related to the Clintons. The next day, well, actually a couple of hours later, I received a call from Lynn asking if I'd ever used the PVTA and how to get to actually the Shade Tree Lab, where I met her and was able to join the lab, and I was so excited about that. She always made me feel inclusive. There were dinners every Wednesday night with luminaries, including one that I recall with very distinctly with the colorful, eminent evolutionary biologist Lee Van Valen, who was at University of Chicago at the time, who serenaded us with music on dinosaurs and paramecia. And I remember the last line said something to the effect of, "Stomp your feet, shake your tail," at 6.5 on the Richter scale. The next semester I took environmental evolution, and this was the first project I turned in. We were meant to all create a time scale that showed, that represented geological time, and this is the time scale I chose to use. Lynn had introduced me to Dos Equis by that point, and so this was a representation there of Dos Equis, and I wanted to get across that when we think of multicellular life, we're really just thinking of just the head of actually a beer. And even when you take a drink, you're actually drinking down from the very bottom of the age of the earth with every sip. And this is along the lines of what Lynn was talking about in class, because she had such a deep appreciation for the first 3.5 billion years of life on the planet. And she had a really great quote about this, which was, "Life on Earth is such a good story, you can't afford to miss the beginning. Do historians begin their study of civilization with the founding of Los Angeles? This is what studying natural history is like if we ignore the microcosm." And said another way, she had mentioned that her zoologist colleagues had a data set that was some 3 billion years out of date. Over the course of my academic upbringing, I took 3 classes with Lynn, and then I undertook a senior thesis honors study with her on some 20 million year old polyxenid millipedes in amber. There's a picture over there on the left. And one thing that was interesting about a lot of the work in Lynn's lab is that it was somewhat set in a fortuitous encounter. In this case, several pieces of amber were dropped on the ground by one of her sons who was attempting to do a magic trick and fortuitously opened up this window of microbes that otherwise wouldn't have been seen. On the right-hand side are colonies of intestinal bacilli from a modern polyzenid amber, which Lynn let me up to my own devices to call luminaries in the field and ask and beg to get these materials, which they were happy to ship in. Another thing that came from this project were a couple of phone calls from Homeland Security, because the story was really about looking at these spore-forming bacteria that are very similar to anthrax. And as Andrew had pointed out, we were able to meet with all kinds of heroes in the field. This was a time that Lynn took me to a book signing at Ernst Mayer's 95th birthday, where What Evolution Is, and there's a picture of Ernst and Lynn at that event. Now also, in addition to her wide breadth of knowledge in the multiple fields of sciences, Lynn, I felt like, could also be considered a professor of aesthetics. She was very interested in art and architecture. Here's a picture of her at the Montreal Biosphere that was created by Buckminster Fuller. And when I was looking through my photo albums, I had a lot of pictures of being in the field or being various places with Lynn, but not really many of us together. But here's one that's somewhat like that, because she's taking a picture, or she's video filming me while I'm taking a picture of her. Being in her lab also meant that you were provided the opportunity to go out all kinds of places. And I was just taking a tally yesterday, and with Lynn I was able to go to 5 countries, 9 states, and 1 U.S. territory. I also wanted to share with you some of the organisms that she loved so dearly. I would frequently, people have mentioned long conversations, long voicemail messages, heavily annotated manuscripts, etc., but she also liked to send priority mail or express mail envelopes that were stuffed and packed. I don't know how the post office let them get through. They'd be duct taped on serious sides, and you'd open them up, there would be a plethora of information and pictures and whatnot. Now, for people who were in Lynn's office, you may have seen this acacia tree that's from the Serengeti and in Tanzania and East Africa. And when I started making this slide, I wrote at the top, "Big mammals key to tree-ant cooperation," and realized Lynn would be very disappointed that I was so mammal-centric, and so I changed it to ant bodyguards, thinking that she would appreciate the turning it into an insect story. But essentially what was so fascinating here, and Lynn was really good about getting you so excited about these truths of organisms that seem so strange and alien, but were actually things that were in existence. And this is a whistling tree, and so and the thorns swell up and there are holes there, and the tree actually literally whistles. But it does that because the thorns swell so that it becomes a nesting site for biting ants, and this becomes a deterrent for large herbivorous animals to be eating these trees. And this was something that we had been talking about recently because of a joint interest in looking at the coevolution of primary producers and consumers and how that influenced the geological carbon cycle throughout the Phanerozoic. Now, I just wanted to end with 3 life lessons that I learned from Lynn. The first was to take risks, and as an aside, the reason I'm showing this portion of Connecticut to you is because this was an impromptu field site thanks to a disobedient timing belt. I don't think you can count it as the 6th car accident where Ricardo was alluding to, but there was a slight runoff on the road, and I'd like to say it was because of a disobedient timing belt. But this allowed for an impromptu field site, and I call this a risk because Lynn grabbed my hand. If anyone's ever been here to the entrance on the ramp to 9 South from 15 in East Berlin, Connecticut, you know it is actually a very quite busy road. Lynn grabbed my hand, ran across the street with me, and had me explain the geology to her, being that I was getting a degree in geological sciences, and then we went back across the street and waited for the tow truck. And I also wanted to just show you visually the landscape. Lynn was very interested in visualizing landscapes and how they change through time. And it was another thing that she taught me, getting people on board from a wide variety of disciplines. This is actually a picture I had a friend of mine paint, Victor Lasek, which shows this scene in New England in the late Triassic and the animals and flora that would be living there. The second lesson I learned from Lynn was not to be afraid to emerge as an individual from a collective whole. And the third lesson is to stop eating so much chewy candy.